In 1955, Albert Cohen, who would become a famous criminologist, published his textbook Delinquent Boys: The Culture of the Gang. This would become a very important textbook in the budding field of critical criminology, and it introduced a concept called statist frustration. However, Cohen was often criticized for his introduction to the topic. Namely, he argued that it was only worth studying boys and masculine groups. He introduced his text by saying that his voice was not flute-like, and that he didn't have the qualities of grace that someone like his wife possessed. Instead, he argued women were incapable of handling the gruff situations that came with gang life, that they were incapable of discussing the internal workings of an automobile, or that they were not too upset by their modest attainment in the field of mathematics. Needless to say, this was a pretty important piece of dialogue that has spurred many criticisms since it was first published. Today, we're going to look at some of the latent prejudices that are present in criminology and can be traced back to some of the early biological theories that have shaped the way criminology has come to play to this day. Hello everyone, it's Professor Popham here for CC100. Today, as I mentioned before the jump, we're going to be talking about the underlying biological prejudices that are present in much of early criminological thinking, and, more importantly, have continued to affect criminological thinking to this day. Now, this is going to venture into some areas relating to racism and misogyny, so I do want to start out by acknowledging that I am neither a woman nor a person who identifies as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. Nonetheless, I think it's important that we have this introductory topic, and I hope that this will spur future dialogue that you have with your professors and perhaps some future academic inquiry about these subjects. You'll recall from our previous classes that one of the critiques I mentioned was the gendered approach to criminology that was produced by many classical criminologists, and in particular, the positive criminologists who sought to seek a solution to crime that was born of biological characteristics, whether it was the shape of our skull in phrenology, the atavistic shape of our body per people like Lombroso, or because of underlying inherent psychological traits that were inherited from either our father or our mother. You might be wondering, why is it important that we dig up these old ghosts? After all, the positivistic field of criminology died out around the turn of the last century, more than 100 years ago. But the reality is that many of these positive theorists, despite having had their work critiqued and debunked, remained influential throughout much of the 20th century and shaped many of the criminological ideologies that we use to this day. Take, for example, Lombroso's The Criminal Woman, published in 1901. In this textbook, he tries to draw the distinction between the criminal woman and the normal woman that he defines based on his own experiences. Lombroso began to study women who had been incarcerated at the turn of the last century, so in the 1800s, by focusing on women who had been incarcerated for moralistic crimes, primarily the sex trade. Upon reviewing the women who were incarcerated, he began to notice abnormalities and associate those with their mental characteristics. Ultimately, Lombroso decided that women who were in trouble with the law, generally for crimes of morality such as engaging in the sex trade, had moral problems. That is, they had deficiencies and were incapable of developing the same level of morality. Perhaps, Lombroso argued, that some were superwomen, women who were actually more closer to men physiologically than women. Using all this information, he was able to pit his observations against his idealized notion of what a normal woman was. And from the difference between these two subjects, was able to determine that there were some atavistic principles, or perhaps some other physiological principles, that set aside the criminal woman. What's important here is that Lombroso's work on the criminal woman influenced his son-in-law and student Raphael Garofalo, who would write the textbook Criminology in 1914, one of the very earliest instances where the term was used, to further define the differences between men, women, criminals, and non-criminals. Within his textbook, he continued to reflect on many of the observations that he had made with Lombroso as they toured women's prisons in Italy, and in particular pointed out that there were many physical deficiencies observed in the women who had been criminalized. For some reason, he didn't seem to think about how the hard lives and the lives of poverty that they had been living may have affected that physiology. Nonetheless, given his high status within the Italian government, Raffaele Garofalo's textbook became widely available and translated into English, influencing a number of other scholars. In addition to his observations on women, Garofalo would also argue that there was a distinction between the born criminal and the pseudo-criminal. The first category were those who were born with the atavistic tendencies that had been identified by Lombroso in his earlier works. The second, the pseudo-criminals, were those who fell into criminal behaviors later on in life, often due to opportunity. This idea of opportunity would influence another author, Edwin Sutherland, who began writing about criminology in the 1920s and would continue to do so until his death in 1947. His ideas would inspire the work of Ronald Akers, who would write about the social learning theory. And the social learning theory remains to this day to be one of the most significant criminological theories that is in use by classical criminologists in the modern context. Now, while Akers has attempted to move away from some of the gendered perspectives that existed in early criminological literature, they nonetheless remain in the works of the people that inspired him, including Edwin Sutherland, and also some of the people who have been inspired by him continue to use a gendered divide when they try to test crime and criminological theories. While many of these classical approaches to criminology focus on the external environmental factors and their influence on a person's criminality, they nonetheless add exceptionalities into the mix when trying to explain the unexplainable or unpredictable crimes that may occur at moments of passion. For women, this was often used to explain their criminality. It was related to moments of irritability, perjury, and moral ineptitude, rather than other external factors that might influence the criminality of men. Sutherland and Cressy, one of his students, would go on to argue that women were least likely to get in trouble with the law when they lived in societies where there was a high level of surveillance over their actions. Conversely, they argued that greater levels of equality led to greater levels of criminality in women, in part because there was greater acknowledgement of their own free will. These arguments continue to be discussed in much of the modern criminological scope. For instance, as late as the early 2000s, there was ongoing debate about the criminal justice system's use of the PMS defense for women who had acted violently against their intimate partners or others with whom they had an intimate relationship. The pejorative use of hysteria has often been employed as a mechanism for defining women as lesser beings than men. Specifically, it suggests that an emotional excess, an external set of forces, have influenced a woman's behavior, something that does not influence men or is not perceived to influence men to the same extent. Hopefully you can connect this line of thinking with some of the criticisms that were labeled against the use of the PMS defense in court, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, as it gained more and more press coverage. This is yet another example of the biological positivistic standpoint influencing the way people think about and act in relation to our criminal justice system. So that's about it for now. We're going to talk a lot about biological theories during class this week, but I wanted to give you a bit of a primer that connected some of the ideas that we spoke about last class with the ideas that we're going to talk about this week. Thank you very much for being here, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all in class. Until then,